So, welcome to the Oxford Clay Pottery Podcast. I'm Catherine Tomlinson, and I started an eco conscious pottery company called Oxford Clay. Now, at Oxford Clay, I don't just make pottery, I also make resources such as books and courses and information for other potters who want to be more eco-conscious in their pottery practice but maybe don't know where to start or can't find out the information they need. So that's what this podcast is all about. It's about sharing everything I've learned along my eco-conscious pottery journey with you, and I can't wait to get started. So let's go. Hello, welcome back to the Oxford Clay Pottery Podcast. I'm your host, Catherine Tomlinson, and today's episode is called Give Yourself Permission to Grow in Your Pottery. Okay. Since I've started doing recording episodes about how I make pottery, and this is how I'm doing this, and then maybe a year later or something, oh, this is actually how I'm doing this. um, it's kind of occurred to me that there's a kind of really interesting thing happening in my kind of brain about how say like for example I did how I once did things like a year ago and how I'm doing things now. It's different. If it's different, then there's this kind of weird feeling that's coming up for me, which is like, oh, like I should have known then that actually that was how I do how I would have done, like how I should have done something then is how I'm doing it now. That's how I should have done it then. And yeah, I think this can really come up in pottery because it's such a kind of protracted kind of like growth process in terms of improving your technical skills over time. You can look back at things you made and think, gosh, I can't believe I made it like that, and now I wouldn't make it like that. And there's this kind of weird kind of judgment thing that's happening, or like there's a weird kind of, I want to say like a feeling of kind of almost like shame that you didn't know something then. And that sounds like a really strong way of putting it, but um yeah, I just thought it'd be a really, really good episode to kind of like just talk about some things like vulnerably that I've changed, but also just kind of like some kind of new ways of thinking about your pottery growth and giving yourself permission to grow in your own pottery, grow and change and develop and change how you're doing stuff. I think it's a really good thing because it's like you can just become more and more and more like yourself. You're learning more and more and more, and you can be more, you're just being more and more your authentic self as a potter. Okay, so this can happen, I guess, in a pottery class setting or something, when, evening class or something, if someone like teaches you a technique and you're like, okay, that's a technique, I'm learning how to do it. But then, say, like, for example, then, I don't know, you realize that you don't enjoy that technique very much. And you're like, okay, well, I'm going to maybe do it. The more you learn, the more you're like, well, I'm kind of going to do it my way. Or, say, like, use a certain material or something. I don't know, like, for example, I don't know, say like for example, you use animal hair paintbrushes in a pottery evening class, and then as you kind of progress your practice, maybe you're vegan, you don't want to use animal products in your pottery anymore, and so you're like, oh, but I did it then and I didn't like the way I did it or something, and then now you're like, you've chosen differently. You're like, well, now I'm only using synthetic paintbrushes, or I don't use leather in my pottery practice. And so it's like giving yourself permission to change and evolve, and that's okay. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about. So okay, let me tell you some things that I've actually changed in my pottery practice, that I thought I was doing it the very, very best way, and then I realized actually there's a better way of doing it, and that's okay. Okay, so the first thing to say is that unfortunately a lot of these things are actually documented, so you might just have the documentation. If you're like making, I don't know, if you're making pots, you'll have that documentation in your kind of physical form of your pottery. So like, say for example, from your first pot to your latest pot, that's probably going to be like to document that change in your like technical skills, or change in the materials you like to use, or change in the techniques. And and all of that is like fantastic, and like it shows that you're like evolving, and that's fantastic. So a lot of my stuff is actually documented, I guess, in like, me telling you about stuff in videos, or, me telling you about stuff in like the books I've written and stuff. And so, yeah, it feels like really vulnerable for me to like kind of tell you this. I thought it'd be really good practice for me to like tell you some things that I'm feeling, that I now do in a different way. So, okay, so the first thing, in fact, this is kind of interesting because like I basically like released an episode about this quite recently about like making glaze tests, and there's a whole episode on like this is how I make glaze tests, and I make these little dishes. I basically told you all about how I made these like little dishes and how it's great to make something with vertical sides, then you can see how the glaze runs. And it's great to make a design in the middle of pots, or any kind of textured surface when you do a glaze test, so you can see how the glaze is on that test and stuff. And all of that is absolutely true. But the thing is, it was taking me so long to make like little dishes to make glaze tests. So for lots of the pottery books that I've written, I made these like little dishes, and I spent hours and hours making little dishes, and then I would like meticulously kind of make sure that each one like was kind of like labeled on the back of like the kind of number, like the glaze, the kind of test number it was. And when I'd come to photograph it, I would then have to like turn it over, and I'd be like, oh, which one's that? And quite a lot of the ash glazes that I would do, all the leaf ash glazes and all the kind of other ash glazes I tested in pottery glazing with plant ash, that book, and also all the leaf ash glazes I tested in leaf ash glazing. They're all done on these little dishes. And when I photographed them, quite often I would be a bit like, oh, hang on, which one was that again? And I'd have a photograph of it, and I'd be like, oh, and then I'd be like, oh, hang on, what was it? Oh, yeah, it was Z12 or something. And like, that was a fantastic way of testing glazes, but um, like for the latest book that I wrote on eco-conscious pottery color, just making like 100 dishes or something for all these kind of glaze tests. I was testing so many different glazes, all the different permutations of clay and verdigris and rust, and like all the different like mixes of those. And I thought I can't make 100 like little dishes, and also the colors, I need to kind of be able to see what test I'm photographing. So what I started doing, so this is like an evolution, a kind of, a change, a permission. I gave myself permission to grow in my pottery by making just loads and loads of glaze tests, which were like flat pieces of pottery. And I did a textured surface because I stamped the word Oxford in them with an plastic acrylic stamp. And then I, stamped some letters and numbers in each glaze, at the end of each glaze test, so I could tell like what one it was. But the really good thing about this was that like I was able then to see what glaze test I was actually photographing when I photographed it, because I just photographed it from like the front, and then I could see the code, the number that I'd done on the glaze test, and I could see the color of the glaze test. So yeah, okay, these weren't vertical dishes. They weren't, testing a glaze on a dish. So, I couldn't see like how the glaze would run and stuff. But I thought, you know what, like for, the 80 plus glaze tests that I tested, the colors I was testing for eco-conscious pottery color, I just thought this is good. This is permission to grow, permission to try something different, permission to do glaze testing in a different way. So there we go. So that's something that I changed recently for that book. And then another thing that I think I even spoke about in that episode of like how to do glaze testing was like that I talked about the scales I use, and I was like, oh, it's fine to use kitchen scales, which are like, they go down to like zero point 0.5 grams, and that's completely enough to do glaze testing, and this is fine and stuff like that. But then, then because I was making such kind of loads of small glaze tests for eco-conscious pottery color, I thought this is not going to work. This zero point 0.5 gram, kitchen scales. This is just not going to work. So what I had to invest in was like tiny, tiny scales. These little tiny scales, which you can get like off the internet for like weighing out. I think for weighing out tiny amounts of stuff, basically. And these scales go down to zero point 0.1 grams, which is just amazing. So yeah, like it meant that I could do like tiny, tiny tests. So lots and lots of tiny tests. It was much more economical with like ingredients and my time and like just kind of reusing like a glaze test. I could then like dry it out, powder it again, and then, make a different concentration of like verdigris, or clay or whatever glaze I was testing. And it was, yeah, it was much, much better to be able to weigh out teeny weeny amounts of like metal oxides of the rust and the verdigris that I was using for eco-conscious pottery color. So that worked really, really well. And like, yeah, it just wouldn't have been feasible really to use kitchen scales that went down to like zero point 0.5 grams. Yeah, that wouldn't just like, yeah. So yeah, it allowed me to make like a loads and loads of different color variations, and like, even go down to like say like, zero point out like, yes, 0.2% of a glaze, making that with a verdigris like on top of a base glaze recipe, and making like, really beautiful, very light blues with like 0.2% and stuff like that. So that's something that I evolved, and like I think it's better. And like, yeah, okay, I made a whole episode on how I did it one way, and now I'm telling you like I'm doing it a different way now, but that's okay. Like it's okay. It's okay. Permission to grow, permission to change the way you do things in your pottery. So okay, the next thing I wanted to talk to you about was something which I've changed in terms of the way I'm doing ash glazing now. And like so I've got two books which I wrote on pottery glazing with plant ash. And the first book, the first book is called Pottery Glazing with Plant Ash, and it's basically just like loads and loads of recipes that I created using like different plants, basically the ashes from different plants. And it was like, leaves of stuff, and it was like the kind of dried wood that I found that was, say like storm damaged wood, or things like runner bean pods is one. So, all sorts of different plant materials in there. But in this book, right, I spoke about, I wrote about how, like, when you sieve ash, you can just sieve it with like a sieve which is like 80 mesh size. And so that was like, it was okay for loads of those ashes. It was great. It was like, very economical in terms of time. It didn't take too long, and it gave like a smooth glaze. It was fine. And but when I came to do leaf ash glazing, the second ash glazing book I wrote, what I realized was that actually the glazes that I was making with leaves, because I'd like picked a lot of them up from like, soily parks and the roadside where there's lots of grit, I actually needed to sieve them through a finer sieve. Now, this might not seem like a big difference at all, but it actually makes quite a lot of difference in terms of like the glaze which is produced. So with like leaf ash glazing, I sieved all of these leaf ashes through 100 mesh sieve. Now, like I said, that might seem like a really, really small difference, but what it does is it actually makes sure that there's absolutely no grit in the glaze at all. And so you get like beautiful smooth glazes in a way that, maybe you didn't with pottery glazing with plant ash. So as much. And another thing it does is it has a really interesting effect on the color. So in leaf ash glazing, so all the glazes made with leaves they're all like one color. Basically, you don't get this kind of as much like a kind of speckledy effect, whereas in pottery glazing with plant ash, a lot of the glazes are really, really speckledy. And this is because I think they were sieved through, the 80 mesh sieve size. And I think that if you sieve it through 100 mesh sieve size, I think you do get like a variation in the color. The color is almost like more intrinsic to the glaze, less kind of like speckledy. So that's like, yeah, that's something I've kind of changed basically in terms of the way I now make my ash glazes. I now always sieve them through 100 mesh sieve size when they're dry, and then I actually re-sieve them when they're wet through the same sieve size again. And that does take a really long time, because I don't know if you've ever tried sieving ash, but it takes absolutely ages. You like sieve it like, with silicone spatula. Like, I mean, it's probably good to listen to a podcast or something, or listen to music or something, like watch some telly or something when you're doing doing it with your FFP3 face mask on, obviously. Um, like, because yeah, just thinking that's probably a bad picture to paint, like you in the living room sieving ash. It's probably, yeah, obviously do it in a safe space that's like, with your FFP3 face mask on. But what I'm saying is it does take a long time, and it's quite good to kind of, just do something else like whilst you're doing it, like, listening to something nice or something. Because yeah, it takes a while, but it's worth it in terms of like the lovely smooth kind of coloured glaze you get and all the lovely smooth like textured glaze you get and stuff like that. So yeah, so that's quite a vulnerable thing to share because I'm like, okay, well, this is a real time example of how, I've actually progressed. Like I've grown in my pottery practice. And so yeah, I just wanted to share those two things with you in case they sort of like, gave you permission to be like, okay, well, I did it that way, but now I'm doing it this way and I want to do it differently now, and that's okay. So in terms of like tips for giving yourself permission to grow in your pottery, um, some of the things I thought were kind of like being gentle with yourself, choosing thoughts like it's okay to grow, it's okay to change the way I'm doing stuff, it's okay to have done something one way and now I'm doing it a different way. All of those things are fine. It's all happening perfectly. You're doing it right. Yeah, so another thing is like, let permission to kind of like not be perfect, like as you're going, if you know what I mean. So like permission to look back and think, okay, well, that was inverted commas imperfect. Hate that kind of term because it's like it implies there is a perfect way of doing it, but there isn't, to be honest. So like, but like just kind of looking back, if your brain's giving you thoughts like, oh look, I didn't do it perfectly. Well, that's okay. Do you know, like you're doing it now. And that's as perfect for the time. That was perfect for that time. And then however you're doing it now is perfect for the time you're doing it. You're doing your pottery now. So yeah, and also I think it's really cool to like look at those kind of early attempts at something as a kind of evidence of like progression in terms of like how you've, I guess, like evolved. I don't want to make it sound like there's somewhere like we're getting to and that's a good thing, because I just think, it's all happening perfectly now in the perfect moment, like in terms of the way you're doing pottery now is like perfect. But I think there is something to be said for kind of like looking back and thinking, okay, so look how it's changed, and that can be like a really positive thing, because it's like it shows that you have the capacity to kind of like try new things, try things, your curiosity, you're following your curiosity, you're experimenting. That's a really good thing, because it's like really helping your creativity, helping generate more creative ideas, helping you enjoy what you're doing, helping you enjoy your pottery. Like yeah, your creative joy is channeling through that kind of experimentation play process that's evidenced by the fact that you've changed how you're doing something. um, yeah, and also I think the last thing to say is just that like I think it really helps to cultivate this sense of like resilience, and like looking back and just being like holding this idea that like it's okay. It's like to hold the idea that like maybe things like weren't how as you wanted them like then, and how things are like, and then probably in the future you're going to look back and think, oh well, now I'm how you're doing things now isn't as good as whatever, good inverted commas, as like how you do it in the future. But like the resilience to be able to hold that kind of imperfection is a real just amazing to have. Like I think pottery is such an amazing thing for cultivating resilience anyway, resilience of like getting things wrong, things going wrong in pottery, like, failing inverted commas, like making mistakes, like trying something that doesn't work, like having an amazing idea, then trying to do it and not being able to sort of action the idea because like you don't have like the equipment or the technical skills or the right ingredients, whatever, so all these things, I think cultivating that resilience to hold that kind of imperfection is really good. And then looking back in terms of like holding that imperfection, like your past pottery and your pottery now, that's also really good. So yeah, it's evidence of like this like exploration, fun, all the joy you've spent learning all those things. That's what it's showing you. So it's been so nice talking to you about this. Yeah, so like give yourself permission to grow in your pottery, give yourself permission to get things inverted commas wrong. Um, and just know it's all part of the process. You're not doing it wrong. You're doing it right. You're doing it right. Yeah. So yeah, It's been really nice to talk to you and wishing you very happy potting. And until the next time on the Oxford Clay podcast, I will see you. Yes, you have a lovely time making pots, and I will see you on the next episode. Goodbye. Oh, yeah. So I hope you enjoyed that episode. And if you're interested to learn more about eco conscious pottery or making your pottery more eco conscious and sustainable, there's so much for you on the Oxford Clay website, which is www.oxfordclay.co.uk. I can't wait to see you there.